bit interested to understand the pandemic, to understand its nature, and to understand its future, then you should pay close attention to what is about to happen. It's my great privilege to be able to introduce my good friend, Nicholas Christakis. If you do not know Nicholas's work, if you did not read yet his book Apollo's Arrow, then you really don't understand the pandemic, and therefore you do not understand the world that we're in. He's a polymath, he's a physician, a social scientist, a network scientist. He is the Sterling Professor of Social and Natural Science at Yale. His other books include Blueprint and The Brilliant Connected, which taught me about 50% of what I know about network science. And Nicholas is joining us remotely from, by the looks of it, a small liberal arts college in New England called, I think is it Yale? Nicholas, it's great to have you here, and I hope you can hear me clearly. I'm glad I asked that question because we can't hear you clearly, which I'm sure is a fixable problem because they fixed it in the last session. We're now going to have a conversation of short staccato question and answer until I can hear you. How is the weather at Yale? Oh, I can hear you now.
You can hear me now?
Excellent, brilliant, it works.
Yes.
Nicholas, I want to ask you a question that you and I pondered months ago. I asked you, is it the beginning of the end? Meaning, are we approaching the beginning of the end of the COVID-19 pandemic? And you startled me by saying, no, this is the end of the beginning. Could you elaborate on that? And is that still what you think?
Yes, it is. And of course, I was, making allusion to the famous saying, from the Second World War. I think you can think of pandemics as having three phases. The initial phase, which is the biological and epidemiological impact as the new pathogen sweeps through the human population worldwide. The intermediate phase, which is sort of like after a tsunami has washed ashore and the wave finally recedes, but now there's destruction everywhere. All the buildings are destroyed. People have been dislocated. So that's the intermediate phase when now we have to clean up the mess that the virus or the wave have left behind. And that's when we cope with the social, economic, psychological, and clinical aftershocks. That's the intermediate phase. And then the post-pandemic phase. I think we are still in the immediate phase, the beginning, which I think will end sometime in 2022. And I can explain why if you want. And then sometime in 2022, we'll transition to this intermediate phase, which will last a couple of years. As you well know, given the economic responses of many governments, given the social disruptions, given the changes in businesses and social lives that we've all experienced. And then I think in 2024 approximately, we'll finally put it all behind us. And I think that will be a little bit of a relief and a party in a way.
Nicholas, that's probably a longer time frame than most people here were hoping for. Is there a moment at which a pandemic becomes endemic, a new disease ceases to come in large waves of excess mortality,
yes,
and becomes more like influenza, something that is no longer
yes,
on the front page, and yet keeps going, so COVID, like influenza, is actually going to be with us for the indefinite future. Is that how we should think about it?
Yes, that's exactly right. That's what's going to happen. This virus will become endemic in our species. What's going to happen first is that everyone on the planet will either be infected with the virus or will be vaccinated. There are very few people who will avoid one of those two fates. Hermits up in mountains, for example, or people who are exceedingly lucky. But either you'll be infected or you'll be vaccinated. So as we vaccinate the population, or as people naturally are infected and either die or recover and acquire immunity, then eventually we will get to a level of immunity in the population known as the herd immunity threshold, which now, given the contagiousness of new variants of the virus, is very high. Probably 80 or 90% of the population will need to be immune. And then at that point, we can begin to think about the virus as being endemic. It won't be eradicated. It'll still be present. It'll circulate and kill some people, but its epidemic force will have been nullified. And incidentally, I know we're moving quickly, but one thing that's very important to understand is that if we get the emergence of new, fully vaccine-evading strains of the virus, or if we get the emergence of new strains of the virus that are much deadlier, the Delta strain is about 30 to 40% deadlier than the original Wuhan strain, then all bets are off. Then we could be almost back where we began at the beginning of the pandemic. And I put the probability of those events at between 1 and 10%. I think it's unlikely, but it's not inconceivable that we might be facing as if a completely new pathogen, maybe with more virulence, that could really significantly harm us. So that would push the timeline forward even more.
So Nicholas, you're of Greek origin, and that means that you know how many letters there are in the Greek alphabet. I believe it's 24, and Delta is the fourth. So there's a 1 to 10% chance that one of the future variants is as contagious as Delta, but significantly more deadly?
Yeah, so there are a couple of things. First of all, when they started using the Greek alphabet, I was very worried, and I thought they don't have enough letters. I mean, they're already up to mu, and in fact, the mu variant on the horizon is something that has many of us concerned. And I think the Cambodian alphabet, I'm not exactly sure, is the longest alphabet, has 74 letters or something. So they should have picked a different one, I think. But anyway.
This is not really funny, though we're laughing. I mean, if you think it's funny that we could get the Omega variant, then yes, you really shouldn't be laughing, because this is scary. And you're saying yes, it's a non-zero probability.
Yes, so I think there are two distinct possibilities. First of all, the Alpha variant, the original so-called UK variant, and the Delta variant, the so-called India variant, both of those were slightly more deadly than the Wuhan variant, and especially in the case of Delta, substantially more transmissible. So that's one of the reasons the Delta variant has been so alarming, is it spreads more easily. Future variants, but none of those variants so far have fully evaded the vaccine. They evaded a little, but not a lot. It's hard to forecast whether we will get a fully vaccine-evading strain of the virus. A lot of debate about this. On the one hand, people argue, well, so many hundreds of millions of people have been infected, and the pandemic has been going on so long, if the virus could have mutated to evade the vaccine, it would already have done so. That's one argument that's optimistic. Other people say, no, actually this virus there's enough intrinsic genetic variability that it could mutate to evade the virus. It's difficult to be sure, and at least speaking for myself, I put the probability of a vaccine-evading strain, fully evading. Delta does reduce the efficacy of the vaccine, but to reduce it by a lot, I put that probability at 1 to 10%. So, but distinct from that is the emergence of new, more deadly strains. Remember the MERS coronavirus, the Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome virus, which is also a coronavirus. It kills 30% of the people that it infects. And COVID kills 1% overall on average of the people it infects. So imagine this virus with lethality similar to its cousin, MERS. Now, I don't think that's likely, but it's not inconceivable. So these are the kinds of low probability, high disutility events that we, should be mindful of. But the more likely, it's going to just continue to unfold as typical respiratory pandemics for the last 300 years. We will eventually reach its endemicity. It'll become endemic. And then we'll begin a kind of cleanup response period, as people have done after epidemics for thousands of years.
So everybody here has been vaccinated. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been able to come in, and they've also been tested. But I would imagine that at least some people here are asking themselves, perhaps they are keeping up with the literature, how long before my vaccine loses its efficacy?
Yes.
Because there seems to be some evidence that if you had the Pfizer vaccine after 6 months, Delta's really capable of getting you, isn't it? And does that mean, and now I'm going to treat you like Dr. Christakis on behalf of everybody else, Doctor, should I get a booster shot now?
Okay, first of all, if you give me a minute or two, I know we're racing, I can answer these questions. Let me try to, there are three components to those questions.
We have time.
Okay, so the first component is, there's a lot of sloppy use of the term booster right now in the public domain. There's the booster where you get another shot of the existing vaccines to boost your immune response. And there are the boosters that the pharmaceutical companies are working on for future variants of the vaccines. I believe that ultimately coronavirus will be very similar to influenza, which you get an annual shot, or tetanus, which you get a shot every 5 or 10 years. I think eventually we're going to be in a situation where human beings get, for maybe 20 or 30 years, until the virus, for various reasons, the virus becomes very attenuated, is likely to happen. It'll become like a cold virus. But I think for a number of maybe 10 or 20 years, we will be getting booster shots that are optimized for the newly emergent strains of coronavirus. That's a different kind of booster, which no one is yet administering, but it's on the horizon. The current boosters that people are talking about is, if you've already gotten a Johnson & Johnson or an AstraZeneca or a Pfizer or Moderna or a Sinovac or a Sinopharm or whatever vaccine you've gotten, should you get another one of those, or perhaps a different one? There's some evidence that getting a different vaccine might be helpful. Here, the trick is the following. When people talk about dropping antibody levels in your body, there's nothing surprising about that. Every vaccinologist expected that. I got the Moderna shot. 6 months later, my antibody levels have fallen to undetectable. That's normal. What you really want to induce in a person is so-called cellular immunity or memory immunity, where their body remembers so that when they're exposed, they quickly ramp up and produce antibodies and fight the virus. So for most people, from the point of view of their own personal risk, in my judgment, it is not necessary to get another shot if you've been fully vaccinated, with some exceptions. Very elderly people, immunocompromised people, and so on. That's from the individual level. I have one more thing to say. However, from the collective level, governments may wish to nevertheless encourage boosters for a very interesting and subtle reason. The reason we might want people to get another booster and have a big jump up in their antibody levels is not so much to help them and reduce their risk of death, but rather to reduce their risk of spreading the disease. If your levels have gone to zero, and I give you a shot, Neil, and your antibody levels skyrocket, if you're then exposed to the virus, you quickly wipe it out, and you don't have a window of time to spread it to someone else. Even though under either scenario you would have survived the infection, but if I've given you a shot and boosted you, now I also decrease your probability of spreading it. This is why, from a collective point of view, it might be wise for governments to encourage people to get third shots or boosters, even though from an individual point of view, for most people, so far as we know, as of now, it's probably not necessary.
Nicholas, we have time for just one more question. And now I want to switch to the network science, social science side of your brain. One of the things that has made the US experience frustrating this year has been vaccine hesitancy or downright vaccine resistance. And we still have a significant percentage of people who say they are not going to get the vaccine. And this means that hospitalization and mortality in the Delta wave have been way higher than in countries with less vaccine hesitancy. How do you, and this is where your network science brain helps, how do you get people who are vaccine resistant, vaccine hesitant, to change their minds? This isn't something a doctor can do, but there seems to be a fundamental problem here in which crazy ideas about vaccines are causing people to decline vaccines and then get very sick and in some cases die. Do you have a fix for that that can overcome the anti-vax movement?
No.
Damn.
I don't have a fix for
I was
that.
counting on you.
But it's a complicated problem, as of course you realize. There are multiple things that it's important to understand there. First of all, in the United States, as many of the listeners probably realize, unlike other countries, whether you get the vaccine or not has come to be a symbol of your political affiliation, which is really stupid that in our country we made mask wearing and vaccine wearing, which are just tools to fight the epidemic, we politicize them So they became symbols and signals of your party affiliation, of your ideology, and so on. First point. To redress that, it helps when you have, for example, or people on the far right saying, politicians coming forward and saying, no, you should be vaccinated. And of course, let's not forget, there's an anti-vax movement on the far left as well, which was the usual source of anti-vax was on the far left. Now we have it on the far right. We've got it on both sides in our country. In addition, there are many people who are vaccine hesitant for pragmatic reasons and are persuadable. For example, now that the drug has been approved, they might be willing, or when their friends have gotten it, they might be willing. Well, the big idea that I would communicate on the network side in the just 30 seconds that probably is remaining to us, Neil, is that lies and misinformation are an intrinsic feature of epidemics. And they have been so, as you know, for thousands of years. People always had superstitions. People always said stupid and false things. People always engaged in denial when there's a deadly germ afoot. And you can think of these as dueling contagions. You have a network of people, the germ is spreading through the network, and lies are spreading through the network. And in some sense, what you want to do is you want to retard the spread of lies and accelerate the spread of the truth so that the information can spread faster than the germ, and we can therefore win against the virus.
Nicholas, we could go on talking about this as we often have for many, many more hours, but I'm afraid our time is up. I want to thank you so much for taking the time on a Friday afternoon to join us. Ladies and gentlemen, Nicholas Christakis, read his book. Thanks very much.
Thank you.